My son, whom I raised for 25 years, betrayed me. At his wedding, he gave me the farthest, loneliest seat to keep me hidden, ashamed to show me to the other guests and his new in-laws. But by the end of this story, he'll realize what he's done, only it will be too late. Dear friends, your comments mean the world to us. Like this video and write where you are watching us from. We will be happy to send you our regards. There are weddings where every ribbon and hors d'oeuvre seems to hum in the same key. And then there are weddings where the music folds around you like a door shutting. Margaret Blake understood the difference. The instant a young usher steered her past crystal chandeliers, past gilded chairs with calligraphed name cards, and finally to the edge of the reception marquee where a lonely folding table guarded the emergency fire exit. The boy, freckles vivid against his collar, offered polite smile that never reached his eyes. He had instructions, not opinions. Enjoy the celebration, ma'am. He vanished before she could ask if perhaps her place card had simply migrated. On the linen, that stark white that shows every shadow, lay a single boutonniere someone had forgotten to pin, a bead of water trembling on its stamen. Beside it, an unclaimed chair. No name, no glass. No hint that this corner was meant for a mother who had ironed tiny shirts on school mornings and applauded off-key trumpet recitals in echoing gymnasiums. She slid onto the seat. It creaked. Voicing doubt her spine refused to utter. From here the hall stretched like a theater where every row had cost more than she could afford, and the stage at the far end glowed with fairy lights strung in a net, the Lang family's idea of coastal whimsy. Somewhere behind those lights stood Richard, her only child, strumming nerves against rented vows. Margaret pressed a palm to her chest, feeling the dull drum in her sternum that had knocked a little too hard these past months, as if it wanted out. Around her, glittering guests toasted with flutes that flashed starbursts. Conversations eddied about stock splits, scuba vacations, bespoke cake flavors. Their laughter sounded to Margaret like silverware dropped into a sink, sharp, metallic, quickly swallowed. She traced the hem of her black silk scarf, a habit since Charles's funeral 3 years earlier. Some widows retire their mourning garb after a season. She kept hers, not for drama, but because color felt dishonest, like singing harmony to a hymn she no longer believed. A server approached with a tray. "Sparkling cider?" he whispered, noticing perhaps how her blouse had been crisply pressed, though the cuffs were frayed. She accepted, grateful for his unforced kindness. The glass sweated in her fingers, and for a second she considered whether to dab away the moisture, an old reflex. From library work, keeping first editions pristine, but let it drip instead, a bead falling to the tips of sensible shoes. Then the MC's microphone popped. "Please rise for Mr. and Mrs. Richard Blake." A surge rolled through the hall, bodies lifting, necks craning. Margaret rose slower, joints stiff, and saw her son emerge with Rebecca on his arm, both radiant as if someone had peeled fear from their faces just in time. Rebecca's gown swept the floor like milk poured in slow motion. Richard's grin had corners she didn't recognize, wider, practiced, maybe borrowed from magazine ads taped to a vision board. As they passed tables, guests extended hands, clinking china bells. Richard leaned to whisper into Rebecca's ear. She laughed, sound tinkling up to the high peak of the tent. They were two crescendos finding a third note. Yet when their path veered near Margaret's exile corner, Richard's gaze skimmed over her like a stone skipping water. He did not falter, did not break stride to wave or mouth loving reassurance. If he'd rehearsed a nod for her, he lost it now among chandelier reflections. The new couple curved away toward the head table where seats bore gold lettering and favor boxes tied in coral ribbon. Margaret lowered herself, knees cracking. A new emptiness settled, heavy as folded wool. She lifted the untouched flower, cradling it between thumb and forefinger. White petals. Ivory, really. Tinged green at the base, color of beginnings. She expected grief to choke, but instead an eerie detachment seeped in, cool and numbing, like the hush before ocean fog swallows a lighthouse. She pinned the bloom near her scarf knot. It looked absurd against midnight fabric. A single star pinned to a night sky no astronomer would chart. Somewhere in the distance, a string quartet found the downbeat of a jazz standard, Rebecca's choice, ambient yet modern. The musicians' bows moved as one. Margaret studied them, thinking how people who share a sheet of music rarely share the same life story, yet harmony still blooms. Her gaze drifted back to her son, laughing at a joke from Rebecca's father. Harold Lang slapped Richard's back with proprietary pride. In that gesture, Margaret read a new ledger line. Son transferred to another column. Asset reclassified. She sipped cider, empty flavor fizzing out before it reached memory. For a heartbeat, she wondered if Charles would have been seated here too had he lived. No, they'd have placed him by the bar, she decided, so he could tell fishermen's tales to finance executives, and everyone would think him charmingly authentic. Charles had possessed that gift. Unembarrassable warmth. Perhaps Richard sensed he hadn't inherited it, and compensated with Polish. The usher returned, murmured that ceremony photos would begin. Family first, he announced to no one in particular. Margaret rose automatically, but he shook his head gently. Immediate wedding party only, ma'am. She sank back, heart fluttering like a trapped swallow. The server from earlier placed a tiny plate before her, 2 canapes left over, and whispered, "Don't let them catch you starving." She blinked thanks, focusing on the bite-sized indulgences, goat cheese and fig on brioche, smoked salmon curled atop cucumber. Each tasted of someone else's celebration. Through a gap in the guests, she saw the photographer pose Richard between Harold and Julia Lang, while Rebecca adjusted Richard's boutonniere to match the bridal bouquet. There was room beside them, just a sliver, but enough for a mother if anyone invited her. Margaret lifted a hand, half wave, half plea, then anchored it back to her lap when no eyes met hers. That was the moment the emptiness tilted into free fall. The reception lights dimmed for the first dance, but in Margaret's peripheral vision they also seemed to dim inside her, pulling shoreline away from sailors who had not yet measured the tide. The dance floor glimmered like spun sugar under gobo patterns, and the newlyweds swayed to a tune that pretended to be soft when, in fact, each downbeat thumped like a gavel. Margaret could almost feel the vibrations through the thin soles of her shoes, as if the floorboards judged her presence. Around her, couples paired off, chiffon brushing tuxedo wool, champagne swirls in fragile stems. Even the chandelier crystals seemed to waltz in their chains, scattering light across faces flushed by wine and belonging. She studied Richard's posture, broad shoulders, neat haircut Rebecca likely approved. He whispered lyric fragments into Rebecca's ear. She threw her head back, veil lifting like a sail in night breeze. Margaret remembered another dance. Living room carpet, a 4-year-old Richard balanced on top of her bare feet while Stevie Wonder crackled from Charles's antique radio. Each step uncertain, laughter echoing through rented walls. She had held his hands, and he had trusted her legs to do the guiding. Now he glided without her, guided by music selected from a Spotify algorithm promising modern romance. A hush fell for the speeches. Julia Lang rose first, speaking of open doors and new branches grafted onto oak-steady roots. Guests hummed approval. Harold followed with wry humor about father-in-law initiation fees. Applause pealed. Then it was Richard's turn. He thanked Mom and Dad Lang for hosting, praised Rebecca's creativity, toasted absent friends. When he said, "And to my mother, Margaret, for teaching me perseverance," his voice lifted briefly in her direction, but the spotlight never moved. He did not ask her to stand, did not invite her story into the light. Her name fluttered above the crowd like a program note skipped by the orchestra. The moment shrank, folded, vanished under next toast. Margaret's hands had clapped on instinct once quickly, then retreated to her lap, fingertips cooling against her skirt. She felt an ache behind sternum as though a slow fist tightened. She pressed harder, inhaling quietly, waiting for the knot to loosen. It didn't. Instead, it pulsed. A drum in a distant room getting closer. Dessert arrived, tiers of cake rolled to center. Servers distributed slices, almond and lavender. When a tray finally reached the distant table, only 2 slivers remained. Margaret declined. Sweetness would wedge in her throat. The server insisted, noticing her pallor, yet she shook her head. He left a napkin anyway, folded into a swan. She smoothed its wings flat. Time thickened around her like honey left in cold cupboard. She checked phone messages. None. Knew she shouldn't expect any. Rachel from the library would assume she was still basking. Knew Kendra, the night shift clerk, could shelve without supervision. The world kept turning. Indifferent. Suddenly, Julia Lang hovered at her table, lavender perfume preceding her. "Margaret," she began, tone polite but fragile, "Richard wanted me to be sure you're comfortable. The photographer will do informal shots later. Would you prefer to join then?" The question wrapped itself in good intentions, but the implication was clear. The curated album was complete. Margaret answered with a smile stretched thin as parchment. "I'm fine, thank you. Everything's lovely." The phrase tasted of dust and compromise. Julia's relief flickered. "Wonderful," she said, already pivoting away. That pivot, swift, decisive, clipped Margaret's remaining threads of hope like tailoring shears. The quartet resumed. Guests returned to dancing, but Margaret stood, bracing one hand on the table. The flower in her scarf wilted, browning at edges. She decided fresh air trumped etiquette. Slipping past chairs, she reached the marquee opening. Night wrapped her shoulders like a shawl woven of salt and cedar. Ocean waves roared below cliffside, unseen but insistent. She inhaled. The knot in her chest eased. But behind ribs, a flutter persisted, erratic as a moth. She traced the balustrade until lights from the tent faded, and there, half hidden by hydrangeas, found a servant's bench facing darkness. She sat spine rounding and let tears come, silent, no theatrics. Each tear landed on scarf silk, darkening fabric by degrees until black consumed black. She pictured Charles beside her, his large hand rubbing circles between her shoulder blades, saying, "We raised him to fly, Meg. You can't fault the sky for being wide." But Charles was gone, and sky tonight felt not wide but empty. Footsteps scuffed gravel. She stilled, expecting a staff member to shoo her inside. Instead, a figure approached. Rebecca, veil removed, hair freed into loose waves. In her hand she carried 2 cups of coffee. She offered one. "Thought you might like warmth," she said, voice hushed. Moon silvered her earrings. Margaret hesitated, then accepted. Coffee steamed between them. For a minute they listened to surf. Finally Rebecca said, "I'm sorry about the seating." The planner insisted on a configuration for photos. Margaret nodded. Apology sincere yet powerless. Rebecca's face softened. "Richard loves you. He just worries." Margaret sipped scalding coffee. It tasted of dark roast and unasked questions. "He worries I carry grief like mildew," she whispered. Rebecca didn't deny it. Instead, she said, "We all carry something." She gestured toward the ocean. "I carry fear of deep water, so I build altars of light." Margaret followed her gaze. The marquee glowed against night's bruise, a lantern warding off tide. They drank in silence until Rebecca rose, gown sighing. "Come back inside. Last song soon." Margaret imagined threading through pairs, past cameras, capturing curated joy. "In a moment," she said. Rebecca squeezed her shoulder, then left footsteps filling with dew behind her. Margaret stared at the coffee, steam thinning. She considered the empty chair waiting inside, a prop in someone else's tableau. The knot in her chest loosened just enough for a breath that tasted of sea salt and burnt grounds. She stood, staggering as dizziness flashed white across vision. Gripping rail, she steadied herself. The stars above flickered, but she couldn't decide if they blinked encouragement or farewell. She returned to the marquee just as the DJ announced, "Last dance, everybody." Guests whooped, adrenaline chasing midnight. Margaret slipped to her lonely table. The napkin swan lay flattened, edges curling. She tucked it into her purse like pressed petals. Music began, slow, lilting, a melody that might have scored a dream sequence. Couples merged, sway reclaiming space. Richard and Rebecca glided to center. He rested his forehead against hers, whispers lost beneath applause. Margaret watched, eyes dabbing each frame into memory's album, even knowing she might one day tear out the page. When the bridge swelled, Rebecca scanned the crowd, spotted Margaret, and beckoned. Time paused. Margaret's lungs forgot mechanics. Then Richard followed Rebecca's gaze, and his hand lifted, a plea across fairy lights. She rose, every joint a reluctant hinge, and crossed the dance floor. People parted politely, curiosity trailing like chiffon ribbons. At the edge of their illuminated circle, she hesitated. Richard reached, drawing her in. Rebecca stepped aside, placing Margaret's trembling hands atop Richard's shoulders. The music settled into its final refrain. They danced, not polished, but honest. Richard whispered, "I'm sorry," voice breaking. She swallowed, throat charred. "We'll speak later," she murmured. For now the song did the speaking, a promise neither knew how to keep yet. Around them, guests blurred. Chandeliers smudged into constellations. Margaret felt her heart misstep again, a flutter, then a thud, but she anchored to her son's warmth. When the last chord faded, applause bloomed like fireworks. Richard kissed her temple, then Rebecca's, gathering them both. Cameras flashed, someone cheered. The moment looked perfect, packaged for social timelines. Only Margaret knew it arrived with a price no one yet understood. Later, while sparklers arced the couple toward a vintage Jag, Margaret hung back, silver cinders reflecting in her eyes. She didn't rush forward for farewell photos. She simply lifted a hand, small wave lost in glitter. Richard glanced back, light strobing his face. For half a heartbeat, regret rippled. Then the car door closed, engine purred, and taillights trailed down gravel like embers dying. Guests dispersed to shuttles. The marquee crew began dismantling arcs of light. Margaret retrieved her coat from a row of gilded hooks, the only black among pastels. She stepped into night, scarf fluttering like a weary banner. At the parking lot, she paused, hand on car roof, while that flutter inside her chest grew louder, like pages turned too quickly. A pulse hammered in ears, a breath hitched. She steadied, waited. The world tilted, then righted. Driving the coastal highway, headlights carved tunnels through fog. Each mile marker felt like a question she couldn't yet phrase. She clutched wheel, humming the first dance tune under her breath, though she'd never learned its title. Halfway home, the radio lost station. White noise filled the cabin, a hush mirroring the hollow in her rib cage. At the cottage, she switched on the hallway lamp, its glow amber, forgiving. The antique radio Charles adored sat on sideboard. Out of habit, she twisted the dial. Static crackled, then a faint saxophone drifted, blurred by distance. She closed her eyes. The knot in her chest eased, but beneath it a deeper ache pulsed, foreboding as thunder before a storm you can already smell in the soil. She unpinned the wilted bloom, set it in a teacup of water. It bowed, petals translucent. In its silhouette, she glimpsed her own reflection in the window, outline of a woman who had become background noise at her own son's overture. Upstairs, slipping out of shoes, she felt the floor list again as if the house had become a ship cut from its moorings. She sat on edge of bed, waiting for dizziness to ebb. It did, but left behind a dull ache down her left arm. She massaged the flesh, told herself it was strain from dancing. Still a question hovered. If one more chair had been added to the head table, would pain have found another host? She lay back, the scarf still looped around neck. Outside, surf boomed against rocks. Inside, the radio faded, leaving only wind threading through window sash, a soft, persistent whistle that sounded almost like the voice of someone too far away to catch, but too stubborn to disappear. She listened until sleep claimed her, though sleep tonight felt thin, like lace with holes you only notice when cold air pushes through. In the darkness that followed, the cottage beams moaned, and somewhere within her chest something answered. Faint yet insistent, like a distant instrument, tuning for a dirge no one had requested. Morning slipped into Margaret's cottage the way a timid visitor does. Shoes squeaking, hands fiddling with an apology it doesn't know how to deliver. She woke before dawn, still in the navy dress, whose hem smelled faintly of salt and bonfire smoke from the venue's parting torches. The black scarf lay on the nightstand coiled like a tired snake. For the first time since Charles died, she considered not draping it across her shoulders. The thought frightened her almost as much as returning it to the hanger, so she compromised, tucking it into the pocket of her robe as if grief were something you could fold and carry out of sight. Downstairs, anemic gray light revealed 2 coffee mugs drying by the sink. Hers and Charles's chipped University of Maine cup, the one she'd refused to pack away. She filled it halfway, knowing caffeine would rattle her unsettled heartbeat. Each sip felt heavy, a liquid anchor. Through the window, the Atlantic lay slate-colored and sullen. White caps cracked against the breakwater, echoing the dull pulse in her left shoulder. She tried to summon the librarian's routine, sort laundry piles like overdue books, darks, lights, delicates, in tidy rows. Rinse china teacup with lemon water so stains wouldn't set. Feed the radio a new battery. Instead, she climbed onto Charles's old reading chair and stared at the antique set. Last night it had found the saxophone station by accident. Now the dial refused to catch anything but static. She twisted the knob until her fingers numbed, seeking proof that some frequencies still remembered how to reach her. Nothing. 7 a.m. She should have been at St. Peter's kneeling for matins, but the idea of small talk about the wedding wasn't the decor exquisite, made her stomach pitch. Instead, she pulled on rain boots and stepped outside. The air smelled of kelp and early fall pine needles, sharp enough to wake someone more determined than she felt. As she passed the mailbox, a glint of silver peeked from between grocery flyers. An envelope sized for legal documents bore Richard's hand. Forwarding address request. Her heart flinched. He was making the Boston job permanent, sending paperwork through her because he still trusted her to sort the life he'd left. She slipped the envelope under her arm as if warmth might soften the announcement. Halfway down Harbor Avenue, the world tilted. A sheet of white flooded her vision, and the road's yellow line lunged upward. She grabbed a lamppost, chest tightening like hands wringing cloth. A pair of joggers slowed. "Ma'am, you okay?" one asked. Margaret nodded, speechless until the pavement steadied. Just dizzy spells, she whispered, though the phrase felt insufficient, like describing a tidal wave as a puddle. The joggers urged her to rest. She waved them on, pride prickling, and shuffled home, each step echoing that last dance beat she still heard in her bones. Back inside, she set the forwarding form on the kitchen table and forced herself to read its fine print. A sticky note from Richard clung to the signature line. Mom, we'll sort details after the honeymoon. Could you drop this at the post office? Thank you for everything, Saturday. Rebecca keeps talking about how beautiful you looked. Love, R. Beautiful. The word pulsed with irony because he hadn't looked long enough to know. She fetched a pen, meant to sign, but her fingers cramped around the barrel. Ink bled a shaky swirl that wasn't her name. She tore the note off, folded it until corners met like a closed door, and slipped it inside the chipped mug. She knew sorrow, if left unexpressed, expands like bread dough. Yet every time she considered dialing Richard, an image intervened. Him at the head table, shoulders angled toward a mother who wasn't her. What could she say? That his unpaired chair had rearranged her heartbeat? That she feared her chest pain was more than sorrow? Such revelations belonged to another script, one not written for polite phone calls. Instead, she called the library, voice clipped. I'll need a sick day. Rachel's concern bristled through the line, but Margaret offered no details. She squeezed the receiver until her thumb tingled, then hung up before Rachel's sympathy could wedge into the hollow spaces. Afternoon drifted in quiet increments. Tea cooling. Laundry neglected. She pressed a palm to her sternum, counting irregular thumps. 12 beats, pause, 9 beats. A rhythm unspooling like film catching fire. She rummaged through drawers until she found Charles's emergency aspirin bottle. Only one tablet rattled inside. She swallowed it dry, bracing palms on the counter until the ache retreated to a dull echo. In the blue-gray hush of evening, a knock startled her. It was Clara Owens, widow from 2 cottages down, holding a casserole. Clara's eyes flicked to Margaret's robe, to the scarf pinched white from how tightly Margaret had fisted it. Saw your car hadn't moved, Clara said gently. Thought you could use company. Margaret's instinct was refusal, but the house felt carnivorous, its silence chewing on her heartbeat. She stepped aside. They ate in the living room, plates balanced on knees. Clara spoke of garden pests and a grandchild's spelling bee. Margaret offered monosyllables. Then Clara's tone shifted. I heard the wedding was lovely. 3 simple words, and the air thinned. Margaret set her fork down. It was, she managed. Clara studied her. You're pale. Margaret attempted a chuckle. Widow's complexion, the sun avoids me. But Clara's look lingered, assessing. Margaret's left arm tingled. She rubbed it. Clara took both plates to the sink, returned with a folded leaflet. Heart health screening at St. Luke's this Friday. Come with me, she urged. Margaret hesitated. Appointments meant forms where next of kin was no longer her husband, where emergency contact might not answer. Yet beneath fear, curiosity pulsed. If the ache had a name, maybe it could be negotiated. She nodded. Clara departed, promise secured. Margaret locked the door, leaned against it, and allowed herself to slide to the floor. She pressed fingers to temples, recalling vows she never heard. Had Rebecca vowed to honor Richard's mother? Unlikely. Her chest cramped again, sharper. She breathed through it, but the pain lingered like a warning bell no storm steward could ignore. That night, slipping into bed, she noticed the envelope again. Unsigned, incomplete. She placed it on Charles's pillow, hoping he might understand what she couldn't utter. That forwarding addresses looked a lot like abandonments when your compass pointed nowhere else. The sea roared beyond the glass. She closed her eyes, measuring breaths, each one a compromise between staying present and drifting where memories felt warmer than the ache in her arm. Sleep came fitfully, carrying dreams of folding tables, wobbling under the weight of names that never belonged on place cards. Friday rose brisk and crystalline, the kind of September day that trades summer's sweetness for the metallic promise of frost. Margaret adjusted the black scarf, back in place despite yesterday's rebellion, and met Clara at the driveway. Clara's ancient Subaru rattled like a snare drum, dashboard blinking warnings it had learned to ignore. They drove in silence until coastal pines gave way to brick storefronts and the modest spire of St. Luke's came into view. Inside, the waiting room smelled of antiseptic and paper masks, a scent that reminded Margaret of library archives. Dust plus discipline. She filled forms. Age, medications, emergency contact. Her pen hovered over name someone to drive you home if tests require sedation. For a raw second, she considered writing Richard, but the memory of his passing glance at the reception carved her chest anew. She wrote Clara Owens instead. Blood work. ECG leads on skin paler than copy paper. Blood pressure cuff that squeezed until her fingers tingled. A technician instructed her to lie still. The machine spat graphs of peaks and valleys. Margaret watched ceiling tiles blur, counting cracks, like misfiled chapters. When the cardiologist arrived, Dr. Ahmed Hassan, soft-spoken, his brow furrowed at the printout. He ordered a stress test soon, very soon. She offered a dutiful nod, the kind she gave unruly teenagers skulking in the fantasy aisle. He recommended limiting caffeine, avoiding stress triggers. The advice tasted ironic, like telling a lighthouse to dim when storms gather. At checkout, the receptionist asked for insurance. Margaret presented her late husband's policy card, praying coverage still held. It did barely. A bureaucratic ghost tethered to Charles's social security number. She scheduled the stress test for next Thursday, thanking the receptionist twice, voice brittle. Clara suggested lunch at a seaside cafe. Margaret declined, claiming fatigue. Truth. She feared the smell of grilled fish might unleash sobs she couldn't net. Clara pressed warm fingers to Margaret's wrist. Call if you need anything. Her kindness carved another fissure. Margaret nodded, retreating to her cottage where the radio still hissed static. She slumped in Charles's chair, test folder on her lap. Words like ventricular hypertrophy and ischemia floated, alien yet intimate. She traced the ECG spikes, mountain silhouettes revealing a landscape she'd never climb but might die upon. Afternoon shadows lengthened. She hadn't eaten. She fetched stale crackers, chewed without appetite. The ache in her arm returned, mild but constant, as though a string somewhere pulled taut. She dialed Richard's number, thumb hovering over call button. Memories intervened. Him at age 8, confessing a smashed window pane, her arms opening. Him at 18, suitcase in one hand, scholarship letter in the other. Her tears disguised as allergic irritation. She pressed end. Instead, she composed an email, subject quick update, summarizing tests, insisting nothing urgent. She hovered over send, then added a line. Hope honeymoon was wonderful. When she pressed send, the computer screen flickered as if reluctant to dispatch her half-truths. Evening crept. The ocean, usually her metronome, sounded muffled as if the world wore earplugs. She wandered to the study where her husband's suits still hung. She touched a dark jacket, inhaling ghost cologne. That scent once anchored her during tempests. Now it only reminded her how long a hug lasts after arms disappear. A ping alerted her. Email reply. Mom, Honeymoon great, but back-to-back meetings. Don't worry. We'll video chat Sunday. Love you. 3 sentences. No questions about results, about her pain scale, about whether she needed anything. She stared until words blurred, then shut the laptop. She found herself at the radio again, twisting dial. Suddenly, clear as a memory, Billie Holiday drifted through speakers. I'll be seeing you. The station ID crackled. WMBX Jazz, broadcasting from Boston. Boston, Richard's new city. Coincidence felt orchestrated. She sank to the floor, back against the sideboard, listening as Billie promised to find her beloved in every lovely thing. Tears slipped silent. When the song ended, static swallowed frequencies. She didn't move to retune. Instead, she whispered, I'll be seeing you. To the empty room, words, catching like fish hooks in her throat. That night, she dreamed of a banquet hall where chairs multiplied into infinity, each farther from the head table. She walked and walked, but never reached her son. At dawn, breathless, she awoke to the real ache spreading across her chest like spilled ink. Saturday delivered a postcard from Barcelona. Gaudy rooftops, blue mosaic lizards. Richard's handwriting on the back said the city felt like a living art exhibit. No space for wish you were here. No mention of tests. Margaret pinned the card to fridge with the lobster-shaped magnet, its claw pointing at nothing. She brewed decaf as instructed, but the aroma, weak, submissive, offended her. She poured it out and made real coffee, daring her heart to keep pace. It fluttered, but she sipped anyway, needing the bitterness. Passive plans collapsed midday. Rain clouds gathered, but fatigue pressed heavier than humidity. She attempted to vacuum. Dizziness felled her to knees. Crawling to sofa, she dialed St. Luke's nurse line. On-hold music looped Vivaldi. Her pulse lagged behind violins. When at last someone answered, words spilled. Dizzy, arm ache, pressure. They urged immediate ER visit. She promised yes, but after hanging up, she stared at the phone, paralyzed by the idea of another waiting room, another clipboard. A knock startled her. Clara again, holding tulips bright as sunrise. One look at Margaret's ashen face and Clara's keys were out. Hospital, she declared. Margaret protested. Just fatigue. But Clara's eyes flashed maternal authority. They drove in silence while wipers smeared drizzle into watery brushstrokes across windshield. ER triage whisked Margaret onto a gurney. EKG leads buzzed. Monitors beeped. Dr. Hassan materialized, eyes narrowing at the screen. You're having unstable angina, he murmured, explaining enzymes, ischemic changes. She half listened, half floated, only anchoring when he said, We'll admit you for observation. A nurse inserted IV. Cool saline crawled her veins. Clara squeezed her hand. I'll call Richard. Panic flickered. Margaret didn't want her son to board a flight out of obligation, but words failed. Oxygen cannula pressed her nostrils, speech blurred into breath. Clara stepped into hallway. Margaret caught fragments. Cardiac, Boston, your mother. Seconds later, her phone chimed, a text from Richard. OMWs, stay strong, love you. 3 words recycled, now urgent. Nurse wheeled her to a semi-private room. Fluorescent lights hummed. A single chair sat beside bed, upholstered in corporate beige. Not empty, Clara occupied it, knitting needles clicking. The motion soothed. Margaret closed her eyes. Dreamt of ocean tides aligning with heartbeats. Evening. Dr. Hassan updated. Troponin stable but caution warranted. He recommended angiogram Monday. She nodded, consenting to vocabulary she once shelved under Ahmed in the dewy decimals. Night descended. Hospital linen smelled of bleach and resigned hope. Thunder rolled. Rain lashed windows like someone desperate to get in. She fingered the scarf knot, suddenly unbearable. She loosened it, let silk slide to lap. Skin felt exposed, almost naked. Yet relief stirred, like opening a library window after long winter. Somewhere beyond curtain, another patient coughed. Machines beeped irregular lullabies. She thought of Richard in midair, perhaps staring at clouds turned pink by setting sun, unaware that below, his mother counted each beep as though they were distances shrinking. She drifted near sleep when a nurse poked head in. "Visitor, Ms. Blake." Margaret blinked. Too late for normal hours, but there he was. Richard, damp-haired, wrinkled sweatshirt, eyes ringed crimson from flight and fear. He didn't speak immediately. He crossed the room and knelt, resting forehead on her blanket-covered knees the way a child might kneel before bedtime stories. Breath hitched. His shoulders shook. Margaret's chest tightened, not with pain this time, but with flood. She laid a hand on his head, fingers combing familiar hair now peppered at temples. Neither spoke. Monitors filled silence. After a long minute, he whispered, "I wasn't there when Dad died. I almost missed this too." Tears soaked fabric. She stroked his crown, wishing her words could cauterize guilt. Instead, she murmured, "You're here now." He lifted eyes, open wounds of regret. "Mom, the seating, everything was Rebecca's parents' idea. I should have fought harder." She inhaled, feeling heart protest. "We'll talk," she said. Conversation could wait. Presence could not. Richard dragged the chair closer, but instead of sitting, he knelt again, hand in hers. Machines traced their uneven rhythms, his rapid remorse, her fragile persistence. For the first time since the wedding, she felt less like background noise and more like a solo someone had remembered to amplify. Beyond window, rain eased. Street lamps glistened on wet pavement like coins tossed into a dark fountain. Margaret closed her eyes, listened. One monitor beeped steady, one breath uneven, one heart acknowledging company. She did not yet know if she would live to see autumn leaves ignite the Maine coastline. She only knew the chair beside her was no longer empty, and the scarf, folded on nightstand, felt suddenly lighter than any silence she'd carried. The overhead fluorescents never dimmed in the cardiac telemetry ward. They hummed like bees caught behind glass, promising activity even when nothing moved. Margaret woke to that droning at 4:30, pulse fluttering under the blood pressure cuff the night nurse had forgotten to loosen. Richard dozed in the visitor chair, chin tucked to chest, hoodie smelling faintly of jet fuel and stress. The chair was ergonomic only in theory, his tall frame folded into it like a sheet of music crammed into the wrong sleeve. She studied his sleep-soft features, searching for the child who once tucked toy cars into her purse so Mom wouldn't drive lonely. In repose, a familiar vulnerability surfaced. Lower lip slack, eyebrows faintly arched as if questioning the dreamscape. She reached to brush a curl off his forehead. The heart monitor answered with a chirp. Richard startled awake, eyes wide before memory staffed them with relief. "Morning, Mum," he whispered, voice gravelly. He perched on seat edge, fingers instinctively checking the IV line as though paternal instinct had reversed roles overnight. "I didn't mean to wake you," she murmured. Words rasped. Her throat felt sandpapered by oxygen. He shook his head. "Didn't sleep much anyway." His gaze flicked to the amber numbers on the monitor screen. They pulsed 96, higher than ideal, lower than terror. A nurse breezed in, cheerful in tiger-striped scrubs, vitals, chart, pill cup. Margaret swallowed the beta blocker, bitterness lingering like unshed words. When Tiger Scrubs left, Richard drew a pamphlet from his backpack. Understanding Coronary Angiography. Diagrams of arteries spread like metro maps across glossy pages. He tapped a finger on the bold print. Risk factors. Dr. Hassan says plaque might be blocking. His voice cracked, as if the word blocking lodged physically. Margaret reached for his hand. "We'll know tomorrow." She aimed for steadiness, but the sentence wobbled like a library card on uneven tiles. Silence stretched. Somewhere down the hall a code cart rattled by, wheels squealing apology. Richard exhaled. "I need to call HR later. I'm supposed to present final acoustic specs at 9 tomorrow." He laughed without mirth. "They'll manage." A shadow crossed his face, the cost of choosing presence over ambition. The door nudged open again, this time by a clipboard-bearing woman in slate blazer and polite urgency, hospital finance liaison. She asked Richard to step into corridor. Margaret watched his shoulders stiffen. The voices outside were hushed, but certain words slithered under the doorframe. Copay. Retroactive premiums. Collection. Each term pricked her skin like acupuncture needles made of ice. She stared at ceiling tiles, counting fissures. 23 visible cracks, just enough to map a worry for each year she'd raised Richard alone after Charles's fishing trawler seasons kept him weeks at sea. When the liaison left, Richard's expression had calcified. He forced a half smile. "She was wrong about deductibles," he lied badly. Margaret pretended to believe. They both leaned into the fiction like travelers sheltering beneath a bus stop poster during rain. At 7, the breakfast cart rattled in, gelatinous oatmeal, pale coffee. Margaret barely tasted a spoonful. Richard devoured toast as if hunger might restore control. His phone lit. "Rebecca." He answered on second buzz, voice dropping. She heard fragments. "I'm here." "No, canceled Boston. Yes, love you too." His shoulders eased slightly after disconnecting, but worry still perched there, tapping talons. Dr. Hassan entered with rounds, white coat flaring like morning sails. He detailed enzyme trends, scheduled echocardiogram for mid-afternoon, reiterated rest. Richard peppered him with questions. Margaret listened, grateful and ashamed of relying on her son's vigilance. When Hassan left, Richard pulled a small notebook labeled Mum and logged dosage times like a broadcast engineer detailing decibel peaks. Visiting hours relaxed at 9. Clara arrived with a flask of homemade broth and the firm gentleness of women practiced in attending other storms. She hugged Margaret lightly, handed Richard a grocery sack of clean T-shirts. Noticing tension knitted in his brow, she suggested he fetch fresh air. Richard refused until Margaret insisted. Guilt needed oxygen to metabolize, she joked. Alone with Clara, Margaret admitted the finance talk. "Bills kept coming," she said, voice more rust than woodwind. "I shelved them, same as misprinted catalogs." Clara squeezed her hand. "Shelving isn't disappearing," she whispered. Tears threatened. Margaret blinked them back. Embarrassed by their heat, broth lulled her into half-sleep. Dreams rippled, a reception tent morphing into hospital ward, folding tables crashing like waves. She jerked awake to the echo of applause inside her skull. Richard had slipped back, this time with hospital coffee and a newspaper folded to crossword section. A ritual they once shared on lazy Saturdays. Together they puzzled 5 clues before nurses wheeled her to echocardiography. Richard followed like a tether. The lab room was dim, lit only by monitor glow. Cold gel startled goose flesh along her rib cage as the sonographer pressed the probe, capturing images of a heart she barely recognized. On screen, blue and red swirls collided like warring oceans. Richard watched, jaw clenched. The sonographer offered no verdict, only, "The doctor will interpret." Back in bed, Margaret shivered despite warmed blankets. Richard retrieved the forwarding address envelope from his bag. "I shouldn't have asked you to handle paperwork," he murmured. She closed eyes. "It's fine." But the envelope felt heavier than myocardium. He produced a fountain pen, gift from Rebecca's father, flipped the form over, wrote, Forward 2. Richard Blake, but remember you can always send me back, he showed her. The joke stumbled, but managed a grin between them. She finally signed. Letters shaky, cliffs edging into sea. He tucked it away as though sealing a pact, evening-painted windows bronze. Rebecca video called. Crisp hotel suite background, still in honeymoon sundress, though Boston's skyline loomed outside. Her smile strained when she saw IV lines, but she brightened, detailing flight options. Richard cut in. Stay, handle clients, I've got Mum. Rebecca hesitated, then agreed, promising to drive up tomorrow with her parents. After call, Margaret whispered, "Don't lose your life over mine." Richard squeezed her fingers. "Life without you isn't the one I signed up for." The sentence settled between monitors and drip stands, daring fate to comment. Lights dimmed for quiet hours, but Margaret couldn't sleep. She listened to Richard's breathing slip into rhythmic tides, then to her own heart. Tap uncertain Morse code against sternum. Dawn felt far, but fear crooned lullabies in minor key. She pressed call button for extra blanket. Warmth arrived, yet couldn't thaw apprehension. Somewhere outside, sirens wailed. A distant ambulance sprinting toward someone else's crisis. She wondered if future EMTs were already calibrating monitors for her tomorrow. She closed eyes, recited Psalm 46 under breath, and finally, exhaustion outmaneuvered dread. Sunday arrived, draped in a false calm, cloudless, breeze gentling pine boughs, visible through narrow hospital window. The telemetry monitor displayed a respectable 82 BPM, as if overnight anxiety had rebooted with factory settings. Margaret clenched the bedsheet while a phlebotomist drew blood. Crimson filling vials like warnings bottled for later. Richard vanished to shower at a nearby motel, promising bagels. No sooner had the door clicked shut than the ward's hushed rhythm jolted. An unexpected entourage swept in. Rebecca in cream trench coat, flanked by Julia and Harold Lang, city Polish glinting on every clasp and cufflink. A whiff of bergamot trailed them, the scent of boardrooms where sentiment is timed. Rebecca approached first, eyes bright with worry. "Margaret, how are you feeling?" Genuine concern softened her features. Before Margaret could answer, Julia placed a bouquet of hydrangeas on the cabinet, color-blocked perfection. "These brighten any space." Her tone suggested Margaret's room required renovation. Harold lingered near foot of bed, clearing throat like a man rehearsing a speech. Small talk unfurled. Test names, weather, honeymoon anecdotes. Julia detailed Barcelona tapas. Harold praised gaudy archways. Rebecca attempted warmth, but tension wove through syllables, visible in her grip on handbag strap. Richard returned, balancing a tray. Sesame bagels, coffee. At sight of in-laws, he almost spilled. Rebecca hurried to steady cups. Harold seized opportunity. "Son, we're meeting Witherington Associates tomorrow. Your acoustic designs can't wait." Richard's shoulders tightened. "I told HR I'm staying until Mum's procedure." Julia lifted eyebrows, glancing at monitors as if they were stock tickers. "Dear, the doctors have it under control." Margaret felt invisible ink spread across linens, scripting her as liability. She mustered strength. "Richard, go if you must." Speaking drained her. Chest twinged. Richard shook head. "No." Silence sharpened edges. Finally, Rebecca inhaled, voice steadier than silk. "Dad, Mom, we appreciate your concern, but this isn't negotiable." Harold's eyes flicked. Julia's lipstick smile faltered. "Of course," Julia conceded, tone chilled. They made excuses, traffic, dinner reservation, promising to visit tomorrow. Bouquet remained, a bright apology. When they departed, the room exhaled. Richard pinched bridge of nose. Rebecca cupped his cheek. "You're doing right?" He kissed her palm, gratitude flickering. Lunch tray arrived. Gelatin fruit cup blinking under fluorescent glare. Margaret pushed it aside. Richard coaxed, but appetite had fled. An afternoon volunteer wheeled in a portable piano. Otis would have approved. She closed eyes as the volunteer played Someone to Watch Over Me. Tears seeped unbidden. Richard squeezed her hand in tempo. Later, Richard ducked to cafe for tea. Margaret nodded off. She woke to monitors beeping frantic, chest pressured, left arm burning. She reached call button, but fingers fumbled. Pain tunneled vision. Corridor voices muffled. She thought of charred logs after a bonfire, how they glow silently before collapsing. A nurse rushed in, pressed nitroglycerin under tongue, adjusted oxygen. Alarm softened. Pain receded to ache. Dr. Hassan ordered morphine. Pages rustled. Margaret's pulse steadied. Exhaustion blanketed her. Richard burst back, tray crashing to floor at sight of chaos. "Why wasn't I here?" he shouted, voice cracking. Nurse soothed. Dr. Hassan explained transient ischemia, tomorrow's angiogram even more critical. Richard's face drained, but he nodded, swallowing blame. Rebecca arrived minutes later, eyes wide. Richard recounted through trembling lips. She wrapped arms around him, but Margaret noticed how Rebecca's gaze slid to monitors, tallying numbers. Fear reinvented love in real time. Evening visiting hours ended. Rebecca kissed Margaret's forehead, promising breakfast. She guided Richard to motel. He resisted, exhausted. She insisted he shower, sleep 4 hours. He conceded, leaving cell phone on vibrate at bedside. Margaret watched the door close. Moonlight silvered bouquet petals into ghost orchids. Machine's pulse steady, but heart felt fragile as glass under toddler feet. She asked nurse for pen and paper. Under glow of corridor sconce, she wrote, "My dearest Richard, if tomorrow brings news we don't like, know I never felt alone while you held my hand." Words spilled, uneven but relentless. She folded letter, slid it beneath water carafe. In hall, wheelchairs creaked, intercoms whispered. She dozed, letter unfinished. At 3 a.m., Richard slipped back, hair damp, eyes red-lined. He saw paper beneath carafe, unfolded it halfway, then froze. "Mum, no goodbye letters," he whispered. She stirred, eyelids heavy. He crouched, forehead against mattress edge. "I'm not leaving," he vowed. He told her he'd emailed resignation notice, project handoff enclosed. "If a company can't wait, it isn't worth the music." Tears splattered sheet. Margaret brushed them away, feeling each droplet like a baptism. Rebecca, too, returned early, clutching thermos. She announced she'd declined Witherington launch event, choosing to extend freelance leave. "Let's sell the Barcelona contract," she said. Richard started to protest, but she silenced him. "Our life begins with integrity, or it doesn't begin." Dawn cracked horizon lavender. Orderly arrived to prep for pre-op. Electrodes replaced by sterile leads. IV lines flushed. Margaret shivered in thin gown. Richard draped cardigan over shoulders. Rebecca massaged her fingers, recounting silly honeymoon stories. Goose chase in Gothic Quarter, crafting laughter as armor. 6:30. Dr. Hassan entered. Calm tide. Consent forms signed again. He promised sedation, minimal discomfort. Margaret asked one favor. Remove her black scarf during procedure. "I want no darkness following me in." Richard folded scarf, placed it in coat pocket over his heart. 7:10. Gurney wheels rolled. Corridor fluorescence felt cooler than starshine. Richard walked beside, holding her right hand. Nurse guided IV pole on left. At double doors marked Cath Lab. Authorized only, they paused. Richard kissed her knuckles. "I'll be right here." She managed to smile. Rebecca squeezed Margaret's foot through blanket. The doors parted. Gurney glided in. Richard stayed until hinges sealed, swallowing the metallic taste of powerlessness. Through glass panel, he watched staff surround her, blue caps bobbing like captive tides. The monitor traced her rhythm, steady, tentative. He pressed palm to glass as if skins could share heat through polymer. Behind him, hallway clock ticked aloud despite hospital hush, each second a small percussion questioning outcomes. Rebecca slipped arms around his waist. Together, they formed a still point in fluorescent sea. Down the hall, a volunteer wheeled past an old, empty chair from waiting area. It creaked but did not stop. Richard closed eyes, listening for the faint echo of his mother's pulse in the machinery beyond the door, hoping clocks might finally agree to keep time with her heart instead of against it. Richard would later remember the waiting as an hour without hands, a stretch of time so elastic it threatened to snap. When the cath lab doors closed on his mother, the hallway lights above him seemed to sharpen, making porcelain walls appear almost surgical in their brightness. The hour hand on the clock jerked forward once, twice, and then it felt as if the second hand simply gave up, caught in the thick of its own hesitation. Nurses advised he move to the family lounge, but he refused, preferring the corridor's raw proximity. Rebecca remained at his side, the plastic visitor's badge dug into her collarbone, yet she would not unclip it. Through the glass panel, they watched shapes in teal gowns drift about Margaret's still form. An anesthesiologist checking vitals, a tech swiveling the C-arm, Hassan tracing the catheter's path on a monitor pulsing pale blue. Richard tried to count how many times the waveform repeated before disappearing under new data, but the lines merged, uncountable. His imagination filled the silence with worst-case headlines. Unexpected rupture, hypotensive event, fatal arrhythmia. Each phrase felt like a shutter slamming the light from a room. 30 minutes crawled. A gurney rattled past, carrying another patient to recovery. A man older than Margaret, eyes scrunched against the fluorescent onslaught. Richard studied the man's chest, searching for clues in the rhythm of blankets rising. The man breathed. The hallway exhaled. Richard did not. A volunteer offered stale coffee, but the bitter smell made him gag. Rebecca coaxed him into pacing instead. 10 steps one way, 10 back, each squeak of sneaker against vinyl a metronome he wished he could silence. Past the double doors, the surgical shadow play continued. Hassan raised a thumb, perhaps to signal catheter placement, perhaps to ask for a sponge. Richard could not tell. The distance between hope and dread was 2 layers of tempered glass. When at last the doors opened, Hassan emerged, mask lowered. Richard braced. The main blockage was significant but localized, the doctor explained. We placed a stent successfully. Blood flow is restored. Relief landed so abruptly, Richard almost missed the caveat. However, the pivot of a scalpel, we discovered diffuse weakening in the arterial wall and an area of scarring. We'll need an MRI to assess cardiomyopathy. Victory shrank to a caution flag. Still, Hassan's eyes held assurance. For now, she's stable and awake. They were led into recovery, where Margaret lay beneath a soft blanket the color of sea foam. Her cheeks were pale but alive with the flush of sedation. She turned groggy eyes toward her son and managed a whisper. You stayed. Richard pressed a kiss to her knuckles, surprised by how cool they were, as though she had dipped her hand into the Atlantic. He answered simply, Where else? Transport arrived to wheel her to telemetry again. Richard and Rebecca trailed like satellites, passing bulletin boards decked with autumn-themed clip art, orange paper pumpkins smiling above articles on cholesterol control. Back in her room, monitors were reattached, and a nurse settled her in a semi-upright position. Margaret's lids fluttered with exhaustion, but she insisted on holding Richard's hand until the sedatives reclaimed her. 5 hours later, golden afternoon light spilled through blinds. Margaret woke craving broth. The first sip coaxed color into her lips. Richard used the lull to shower and change into clean clothes. Rebecca fielded calls from her parents, tense bursts of conversation she conducted in the hallway. When she returned, she perched on the windowsill and, without invitation, read aloud from a travel magazine about Barcelona. The legend of the basilica's unfinished tower, the architects who died before seeing it complete. Margaret listened, eyelids drooping, until Rebecca reached a line about how the builder's apprentices took over, guided by sketches and devotion. Margaret murmured, "Every cathedral needs new hands." Rebecca folded the magazine, swallowing tears. Twilight fell. A nurse brought in dinner trays. Clear soup, unsalted crackers. Margaret managed 3 spoonfuls before fatigue won. Richard pulled the blanket to her shoulders, brushing stray wisps of hair off her forehead. Machines emitted steady pulses. No arrhythmias, just a guarded rhythm that felt almost trusting. Outside, night louvers shut over the windows and hospital intercom announced visiting hours end. Richard asked to stay as overnight caregiver. The charge nurse agreed under quiet stipulations. Rebecca left for the motel, promising breakfast and fresh clothes. Richard unfolded the convertible recliner chair, but sleep refused him. He sat instead beside his mother, reading her unfinished letter, now carefully tucked under the water carafe. "My dearest Richard." The words blurred. He returned the paper to its hiding place, guilt heavy. At midnight, monitors beeped once, an alarm for low oxygen saturation, then stilled after Margaret shifted. Richard's own heart hammered. He whispered to the dormant scarf in his jacket pocket, "Not tonight, please." The scarf, inanimate but omniscient, offered no reply. Beyond the door, cleaning crews polished floors, their machines singing mechanical lullabies. Richard rested forehead on blanket near his mother's hand, and their sleep finally ambushed him. October's first dawn arrived like a pale chamber music. Oboes of ventilators, pizzicato foy drips, a distant trumpet of trash cart wheels. Margaret woke to find Richard slumped, a convocation of musculoskeletal knots. She reached, stroking his hair. He jerked awake, eyes wild until memory aligned. They smiled. A weary duet. Breakfast came. Watery oatmeal again, tiny triangle of cinnamon toast. Margaret took a cautious bite. Flavor was faint but reliable. Richard inhaled 2 pieces, hunger making him lightheaded. Just as Margaret settled spoon, a soft knock preceded Dr. Hassan's entrance with MRI orders. "Mobile units free," he said. "We'll wheel you in 30. He explained risk of gadolinium contrast, benefit of 3D imaging. Margaret signed consent with a hand that barely trembled. Orderlies arrived promptly, transferring her to a stretcher. Richard followed down corridors that smelled of warm plastic and floor polish. The MRI suite glowed aquamarine, lights low like aquarium tunnels. Richard waited outside. The machine thrummed deep as a ship's engine, swallowing 45 minutes. When doors reopened, Margaret looked chilled, but smile lingered. "They played Ella Fitzgerald in headphones," she whispered, voice raspy from effort. "She scattered me through the tunnel." Richard exhaled tension he hadn't realized he was storing. They returned to room. Soon after, Rachel from the library called Margaret's cell, cautious voice checking if timetable for new acquisitions should be postponed. Margaret reassured her, and on impulse, asked Rachel to donate her unused sick days to intern Lisa, pregnant due in winter. When Margaret ended the call, Richard's eyebrows lifted. She shrugged. Books can wait. Late morning, Dr. Hassan reappeared, MRI images in hand. He spoke gently. Ejection fraction borderline. Scarring indicated stress-induced cardiomyopathy, often reversible if triggers removed. A medication regimen. Lifestyle adjustments. Cardiac rehab. The prognosis can be good, he said, but we need compliance. Richard nodded vigorously. Margaret exhaled, relief mingling with guilt at having carried grief heavy enough to scar muscle. Hassan recommended discharge in 48 hours if vitals remained steady. Barely had the doctor left when Julia and Harold returned, unannounced but impeccably timed. Julia clasped a pastel gift bag, hand cream, lavender shawl, tablet of watercolor paper. Creative therapy, she chirped. Harold carried a slim folder of legal-sized pages. Richard stiffened. Julia's gaze flicked between mother and son. Harold cleared throat. We brought something to lighten your mind. He slid the folder onto bedside table. Payment authorization agreement. Their private health trust would absorb any medical expenses, provided Medicare declined. No one should worry about numbers, Harold said. Generosity radiated, yet Margaret sensed subtext. A ledger balancing reputations. She thanked them. Richard mumbled appreciation, but did not reach for the folder. Julia poured water, remarking how modern medicine did wonders. Rebecca, arriving mid-conversation, sensed tension. She hugged Margaret, then steered her parents into hallway for coffee, leaving paperwork behind. Through the door came muffled debate, Rebecca's voice, steel hiding under silk. Margaret glanced at Richard. They mean well. Richard's jaw clenched. Well has interest rates. He exhaled. We'll decide together. He tucked the folder into his backpack as though delaying its verdict. Margaret rested a hand over her heart. BP cuff tightened. Reading numbers, green and forgiving. Afternoon sunlight slanted through blinds. Dust motes drifting like shaken snow globes. Margaret requested fresh air. Nurse disconnected telemetry, and Richard wheeled her, IV pole and all, to rooftop garden. Planters overflowed with chrysanthemums. A therapy dog sniffed benches. The sea shimmered on horizon. Margaret inhaled salt wind. The scent filled cracks grief had carved. She closed her eyes, letting October sun stipple eyelids. Mom, Richard began, voice hush. I blamed you for withdrawing after Dad died. I see now withdrawal was the only way you knew to keep breathing. She opened eyes to meet his contrition. I should have stepped closer, he added. She shook head. We both stepped away. Words perched fragile. She continued, voice steadier. I clung to black because colors hurt, but black also hides empty chairs. Richard squeezed the handle of her wheelchair. We'll paint new ones, he promised. Sunlight lacquered his earnestness. Evening invited cold wind. They returned to room. Rebecca arrived with takeout miso soup, contraband but welcome. Margaret sipped broth, flavor comforting. Rebecca perched an edge of bed. I spoke to my parents, she said, cheeks flushed. She explained she'd declined their trust's offer. We'll cover bills our way, she asserted. She proposed selling her Barcelona installation rights. The advance would cover out-of-pocket fees. Richard protested, but she pressed finger to his lips. Art can wait, family can't. Margaret's eyes watered. Words failed, replaced by silent blessings. Night descended with fewer alarms. Richard stretched on recliner, Rebecca curled on extra blanket. Margaret watched them twin breathing, a symphony quieter than monitors. She lifted palm to chest. For the first time in months, the space beneath felt inhabited by more than ache. She closed eyes, drifted into dreams where library windows opened to salt air, pages fluttering like gull wings. Dawn shimmered, peach on discharge day, painting the hospital facade in hopeful tones. Richard completed paperwork, clumsily signing next to labels he never wished to learn. Rebecca packed a duffel with slippers, lavender shawl, the Barcelona postcard. Margaret dressed in soft gray sweats Clara had delivered, plus a new scarf, a muted teal she chose from gift shop, timid step away from black. While waiting for transport, Margaret requested a stop at the chapel. Richard wheeled her into the hushed enclave, stained glass panels tinting airmarine blue. She lit a votive candle, whispering the Lord's Prayer but editing, "And forgive us our silences as we forgive those who silence us." Flame wavered, but held. Outside, Clara's Subaru idled by curb. She hugged Margaret, eyes glistening. "Next book club at my house," Clara said. Margaret promised to bring lemon bars, heart secret thrilled by the thought of baking again. During the drive, pines blurred, the ocean glimmered. Margaret pressed forehead to window. Every mile felt like a page turning in a journal she thought finished. At the cottage, sea breeze greeted them. Richard supported her as she stepped inside. Dust motes drifted, but gloom felt thinner. She asked for Charles's radio. Richard tuned dial. Static crackled, then a familiar saxophone riff. Same Boston jazz station. They let it play low. Margaret settled in Charles's recliner, blanket across lap. The teal scarf, sea and sky combined, rested soft against throat. Afternoon glowed. Rebecca made chicken soup. Spices danced. Richard sifted through piled bills, assembling payment plans. Each check he wrote felt like restitution for overlooked love. From recliner, Margaret watched them move about kitchen. Young marriage bent but not broken. The ache in her chest pulsed mild, as though heart wished to rehearse a new beat before committing to performance. Evening's horizon blazed tangerine. They carried soup bowls to porch, sea wind cool but kind. Margaret took a spoonful, savory warmth sliding down. "Tastes of second chances," she said. Richard's lips curved. "Mom, when you're better, we'll host Christmas here." Rebecca added, "No seating charts." Laughter fluttered, tentative but sincere. A gull screeched overhead, diving into twilight. Margaret's gaze followed until the bird vanished against waves. She exhaled, breath carrying a weight she hadn't realized remained. Heart responded with a measured thump, steady and serviceable, like an old librarian stamping due dates. Mindful that stories, though lent, are meant to be returned. Inside, the radio segued into Billie Holiday again. "We'll be seeing you," she crooned. Margaret closed eyes, scarf fluttering. She mouthed the lyrics, tasting melancholy, yes, but also promise. For tonight, promise sufficed. There is an autumn afternoon when the Atlantic loses its summer shimmer and turns the color of gunmetal, and every gull's cry sounds like a question whispered too late. For Margaret, that afternoon arrived the second week of October, 3 weeks after discharge, while she stood on the cottage porch stirring apple butter on a portable burner. Cinnamon steam curled skyward, sweetening salt air. She tasted it, decided Charles would have demanded more clove, and laughed at the memory's tenderness. The laugh triggered a sharp tug beneath her sternum. Only a second, barely a wince, but enough to make the wooden spoon pause mid-swirl. She glanced through the open door where Clara, knitting needles clicking, pretended not to notice. They had developed a pact of silence about these microspasms. Margaret minimized. Clara respected the illusion. The home nurse visited twice a week. Cardiac rehab awaited in town, but the rest was Margaret's stubborn territory. She measured progress by oven timers and pages shelved back at the library in half shifts, granted by indulgent colleagues. Routine, she told herself, was medicine. That Saturday, Richard and Rebecca arrived earlier than expected. Twin silhouettes framed by maple leaves spinning amber confetti across the gravel drive. Richard carried grocery bags. Rebecca balanced a Bluetooth speaker piping Nina Simone. When Margaret greeted them, the tug in her chest retreated, replaced by a warmth no prescription listed. They cooked supper together, pumpkin risotto that turned the kitchen into a kiln of nutmeg and fond laughter. Between stirs, Margaret watched her son deglaze a pan with white wine, noticing how his shoulders had relaxed since the hospital, how conversation now flowed without apology checkpoints. After dishes, they reviewed payment progress. Richard's spreadsheets, color-coded columns of hospital invoices, looked less bloody red than before. Rebecca announced she had accepted a smaller museum contract, freeing evenings for volunteer work at Southside Harmony. They discussed Christmas decorations. Margaret suggested a garland of library cards punched with dried orange slices, both clever and scented. For the first time in months, the future appeared less like a closing ledger and more like a calendar with penciled possibilities. Night settled, crisp enough to require the old oil heater. Richard lit the fireplace while Margaret tuned Charles's radio. The dial, sensitive after repairs, found a low crackle that blossomed into Dave Brubeck's Strange Meadowlark. They each took a mug of mulled cider, and when the piano solo soared, Margaret's foot tapped, a spontaneous syncopation that made Richard beam. "Clinic rhythm test approved," he joked, holding out a hand for a slow dance. She declined with a playful swat, yet inside her chest something fluttered, this time less pain, more shy delight at the idea that music still recognized her pulse. Before bed, she donned the teal scarf, not black, and wandered onto the porch alone. The moon carved a path across the waves, and the lighthouse farther downshore blinked a semaphore of vigilance. She pressed fingers to wrist, counted beats, 65, steady. Yet behind each thump lurked the memory of broken patterns, and she realized her fear wasn't of death, but of leaving sentences unfinished. In the half-moonlight, she whispered, "I'm not done," as if the ocean could grant extensions. Inside, Richard set the guest room cot. Rebecca placed a small gift-wrap box on the nightstand of Margaret's bedroom. An early birthday token, she said, to be opened at dawn. Then silence folded the house. Margaret lay in bed, listening to wind chimes calibrate the night. When sleep finally gathered her, it was thick and dreamless, cotton wadding stuffed around ticking machinery. At 2:17 a.m., ticking became thunder. She bolted awake to a crushing weight against her breastbone like a door slammed by an invisible gale. Pain radiated into jaw, left arm searing. She gasped, air ragged, tried to call out, "Richard!" but voice snagged on the iron in her throat. The room blurred, moonlight fractured. She fumbled for the lamp, knocked it over, glass shattered, a soft apology. Somewhere the radio, left low, shifted frequencies, static, then a trembling trumpet note half formed. She attempted to stand, knees buckled. Floorboards rushed up, but quilt tangled around legs, breaking fall. Her head struck the dresser edge, not hard. The bigger injury raged inside. She lay sideways, cheek pressed to cold wood, staring at Rebecca's unopened box tipped onto its side, wrapping paper printed with tiny silver chairs. From downstairs came soft footsteps. Rebecca heading to bathroom, perhaps. Margaret rasped, "Help!" But the word was airless. She clawed at scarf knot, loosening it as if breath might return. Instead, darkness tunneled her vision. In the narrowing tunnel, she saw Richard at age 4 wearing cardboard armor, declaring her queen. Saw Charles piloting a borrowed dinghy, laughing as spray kissed their young faces. Saw the wedding banquet, empty chair glowing like vacancy incarnate. Saw her son's tears on hospital blanket, promising paint and second chances. A final image emerged, the radio dial, needle trembling between stations. She thought, hold the frequency. Then everything withdrew, sound, color, thought, leaving only a softness, a hush so total it felt merciful. Downstairs, a crash startled Rebecca. She nudged Richard awake. They raced up, found Margaret collapsed, lips blue, eyes half open in stunned surprise. Richard's scream fractured the night. "Mom!" His hands, useless, searched for pulse, found a faint thread, then lost it. Rebecca dialed 911, voice trembling instructions. Unresponsive female, cardiac arrest. Richard performed chest compressions, counting aloud, tears streaking cheeks. A siren approached. Distant at first, then roaring, lights strobed against cottage walls like frantic camera flashes. Paramedics burst in, trading rehearsed commands. Pads, rhythm, charge. Richard knelt aside, breath hitching as the defibrillator fired. Margaret's body jerked, then sagged. Monitor searched for electrical truth. Flat, then a ripple, then stuttering a systole. They loaded her onto stretcher, IVs snaking, airway secured. Richard squeezed her hand, fingers already chilled. In ambulance, he begged, "Stay, Mum, stay." Bystander gulls shrieked overhead as if mocking mortal urgency. The drive to St. Luke's devoured 8 eternal minutes. Inside the ER bay, teams swarmed. Epinephrine, compressions, intubation. Dr. Hassan, summoned from home, arrived with eyes still striped by sleep. He recognized the monitor's cruel story, catastrophic rupture of previously weakened artery. He fought statistics anyway. Another defib hit, another amp of epi. At 3:09 a.m., the flatline widened, unbroken. Time of death recorded 0309, 1 hour and 52 minutes before maritime dawn. Richard's howl split fluorescent quiet. Hassan guided him to chair. Beige, ironically reminiscent of the one at St. Luke's telemetry wing. Richard crumpled, forehead on knees. Nurses offered water. He waved them off. Rebecca wept behind surgical curtain, clutching the teal scarf fallen from Margaret's neck in transit. Its threads smelled of apple butter and hospital antiseptic. Clara arrived, called by paramedics, who recognized her number on fridge. Eyes swollen but resolute. She sat beside Richard, folding him into arms broader than grief's reach. He muttered, "Too late," over and over, syllables eroding. Dawn-tinged windows pale lavender when hospital staff arranged a viewing room. Margaret lay beneath a crisp sheet, face smoothed, IV punctures hidden, an illusion of serenity. Richard entered, knees trembling. He placed trembling palm on her forehead, still cool. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and the phrase spilled into deeper sentences. Sorry for seating charts, for forwarded addresses, for seeing her only as reflection of his own discomfort. He unpacked Rebecca's gift box. Inside, a silver locket shaped like a miniature chair, engraved, "Space reserved for love." He opened the clasp, intending to tuck a photo, but found it already held one, a snapshot of him, age 4, standing on his mother's feet during that living room dance, mouths wide in laughter. He pressed the locket into her fingers, curling them around it. The movement reminded him of how she once guided his pencil grip in kindergarten, teaching loops of cursive he now used to sign checks. Rebecca stepped beside him, draped the teal scarf over sheet near Margaret's heart. "She wanted you to keep color," she whispered. Richard nodded, tears luminous. Funeral arrangements unfurled in dazed blur. Modest church service. Closed coffin lined with lavender shawl Julia had gifted. Julia and Harold attended, subdued. Randy from the library read Psalm 90. Clara sang "It is well with my soul," voice cracking on final amen. Ocean wind carried incense of pine needles and sea-salted grief. After burial, simple near Charles's plot, Richard and Rebecca returned to the cottage. Richard retrieved the folding chair from wedding storage, its gold paint scuffed. He placed it by the radio, draped scarf, laid empty bouquet stalk, then sat on the floor, back against refrigerator, humming faintly. He turned the dial. The jazz station flickered through static, finally settling on Billie Holiday. She crooned, "Everything happens for the best." The irony didn't sting, it wept. Richard opened the library anthology Margaret loved. On first page, she had inscribed a quote by Emily Dickinson. "Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul." He whispered it, voice hoarse, and understood the empty chair wasn't only loss, it was a forever invitation to listen, to static, to jazz, to silences pregnant with echoes of a mother's steadying hum. He closed his eyes. The radio crackled. Waves slammed rocks beyond the window. Somewhere inside those overlapping sounds, he heard her heart's rhythm, irregular, persistent, teaching him still how to keep time with love long after music stops.